My journey through Russia. Russia had long stood in my imagination as both a titan of history and a mystery wrapped in layers of snow and silence. It loomed large in my mind, not just a country, but an idea. I'd seen its echoes in literatures, in cinema, and its vast, wild presence in every world map I ever studied as a child. I knew it was a place of revolutions and poets, gulags and galaxies, gold domes and grey skies, but none of that could prepare me for the truth of being. In March 2025, I packed my belongings into a worn black backpack, kissed my ordinary life goodbye, and boarded a plane that would take me into the heart of a land both frozen in time and rushing into the future. Sheremetyevo Airport in Moscow greeted me with a haze of breath and exhaust. It was early morning, and outside the terminal, the city was blanketed in snow thick enough to mute the usual cacophony of arrival. I could feel the chill right through my coat as I stepped into the bracing wind and summoned a Yandex. The Cyrillic letters on every sign made me feel deliciously lost. I smiled awkwardly at the driver, who nodded with the indifference of someone who has seen too many wide-eyed travelers trying to decode a culture older than their own country. As we glided through the capital's icy arteries, I caught glimpses of golden spires, grey blocks of Soviet-era apartments, and the glass shimmer of new skyscrapers clawing into the overcast sky. Moscow, I quickly learned, doesn't welcome you. It dares you to. My first days were dizzying in the best possible way. The Moscow metro was my first real encounter with Russian grandeur and network, so ornate it put the Louvre to shame. Stations like Mayakovskaya and Komsomolskaya glittered with chandeliers, Art Deco columns, and murals celebrating proletarian strength. I stood transfixed as commuters brushed past me, boots clicking on marble floors, briefcases swinging, eyes fixed. It wasn't just public transit, it was an underground cathedral of endurance. Red Square was every bit as mythic as I imagined. Snow swept across the vast expanse, where the walls of the Kremlin stood like a fortress of memory. St. Basil's Cathedral, that jewel-toned hallucination of domes, looked painted against the clouds. I lingered, letting the sharp angles and soft curves of history. Tourists buzzed around me, taking selfies, but I stayed still. I wanted to listen, to feel the pulse. Lenin's mausoleum stood to one side like a granite secret. Inside, the embalmed body of the man who changed the world lay eerily preserved. The silence is the loudest thing I heard in Moscow. I wandered through Gum, the luxurious 19th century shopping arcade where designer labels glimmered beneath arched glass ceilings. I sipped on thick hot chocolate and watched fashionable Muscovites glide. But just outside, old men sold Soviet-era medals and babushkas haggled over pickles and sunflower seeds in street markets. Russia, I began to see, didn't erase its past, it stacked it like nesting dolls, each era within. Every day brought new contrasts. I visited the Tretyakov Gallery, staring for hours at the tragic beauty of Andrei Rublev's icons, then caught a modern dance performance in a warehouse-turned-theatre in the Zamoskvorechi district. I walked along the Moscow River, its surface like, and then joined a crowd of hipsters drinking craft beer in a converted factory. I spoke broken Russian, but even broken language can build bridges. A student named Anya helped me order borscht and pelmeni at a tucked-away cafe. She told me her grandparents still called Stalin the boss, and her brother now worked in cybersecurity. We live in the middle of the past and the future, she said. After 5 nights, I boarded the Sapson train northward. St. Petersburg was a different planet. Where Moscow was muscle, Petersburg was grace. It was canals and ballet and faded imperial dreams clinging to neoclassical facades. My hostel faced the Fontanka River, and every window framed a painting, the domes of the Church of the Saviour on spilled blood, the misty spires of the Admiralty, the curve of Nevsky Prospect slicing through the heart of the city like a verse from. I spent 3 entire days inside the Hermitage, lost among corridors gilded with centuries. Each room held echoes of stolen treasures and empresses with impossible names. I stood before a Da Vinci and forgot the cold, forgot the. Outside, I walked across Palace Square and thought of revolutions and snowstorms. I visited the Bronze Horseman and whispered a thank you to Peter the Great for founding such madness and majesty in a swamp. I found myself at Dostoevsky's apartment, stared at his desk, and tighten. This was not just tourism. This was communion. One morning, I boarded a hydrofoil across the icy Gulf of Finland to Peterhof. Though the famous fountains slept beneath snow, the baroque beauty of the Grand Palace took my breath away. I stood beneath golden statues that once dazzled French envoys and imagined the Tsars dancing in shadow. Russia never lets you forget who it was, even when it's hiding under frost. From St. Petersburg, I flew to Kazan, capital of Tatarstan, a republic within the Russian Federation that felt like a cultural bridge to another world. The city brimmed with color and contrast. In the Kazan Kremlin, the Kol Sharif Mosque shimmered in turquoise beside Orls. I climbed its minarets and felt as though I could see two worlds at once. I drank fermented mare's milk with locals in a Tatar cafe, bought hand-stitched slippers from a market stall, and listened to a street band play traditional songs as students danced in circles. I marveled at how this city managed to be fully Russian and fully something else, proof that Russia was never a monolith, but. Then came the long ride east. I boarded the Trans-Siberian Railway and settled into a second-class compartment with 3 strangers, a pensioner named Galina, a university student called Misha, and an off-duty soldier who said little but offered me sunflower seeds. For days we rumbled across the endless white forests and frozen rivers, sliding past like a black and white film. I wrote in my journal, read Gogol aloud, learned how to make tea with a chunk of sugar held in the teeth. In stations like Tyumen and Omsk, vendors sold bread and smoked fish through the windows. I learned patience. I learned quiet. Novosibirsk arrived with a blast of wind sharp enough to peel paint. Siberia's unofficial capital was both utilitarian and oddly compelling. Its Lenin Square was flanked by brutalist buildings, yet inside the opera and ballet theatre, a performance of The Nutcracker brought tears to. I met a group of young artists who showed me hidden murals and warmed my hands over mulled wine fires in a loft studio. I visited the museum of the Siberian branch of the Russian Academy of Sciences and marveled at ancient mammoth bones dug from permafrost. The deep time of this land was everywhere. Then came Irkutsk, with its wooden lace houses and proximity to the true marvel, Lake Baikal. I made my way to Listvyanka, where I stayed in a wooden cabin and joined a local guide named Pavel for a walk over the frozen. The ice was a prism of shifting blue and white, and it cracked underfoot like thunder. I knelt and looked down, seeing frozen bubbles trapped in time. Pavel told me Baikal held 1/5 of the world's fresh water and the spirits of his ancestors. That night, we sat by a fire and eating omul fish as he sang songs I couldn't translate but felt in my chest. The adventure wasn't done. I flew to Ulan-Ude, where Buddhist stupas and Mongolian faces changed the tone of the trip again. Here, Russia wore another of its thousand faces. In the shadow of the world's largest Lenin head, a sculpture both surreal and solemn, I watched a shamanic ritual by a frozen river, the smoke of juniper branches rising like ancient prayers. A Buryat elder told me that Russia is not just a country, it's a continent of souls. I- From there, I flew to the Kamchatka Peninsula, the wild crown of the Pacific Rim. The descent into Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky was like entering a dream volcanoes piercing the sky. Ice-blue rivers curling through forest, snow as far as the eye could see. Geologists on a trek through the Valley of Geysers. We rode snowmobiles past steaming fissures and boiling springs, each one a wound in the earth. We bathed in thermal pools under stars that felt so close, I thought I might melt into them. I saw brown bears in the distance and eagles riding thermal currents. There was no slush, just the heartbeat of the land. Kamchatka humbled me. I met people who had never left the peninsula, who hunted, fished, and lived with an intimacy to the land I could only envy. I was invited to a family home in Esso, where a feast of reindeer stew and berry compote awaited. They asked about my world and a story. They told theirs in turn of Soviet memories, volcanic eruptions, and a cousin who once made it all the way to Moscow. My final leg took me to Vladivostok, where Russia ends or begins, depending on how you look. The city spilled over hills into the Sea of Japan. I watched the Pacific crash against Russian shores and felt something shift inside me. I walked across the Rusky Bridge at sunrise, howling like a wolf, and thought of everything I had seen. This was no longer just a trip. It had become a reckoning. Returning to Moscow felt like closing a circle. I spent my final day revisiting old spots, the onion domes of St. Basil's, the pigeons of Red Square, the warm lights of Arbet Street. I bought a Matryoshka doll, each figure inside another, and thought, yes, this is not one face but many, not one story but thousands. I sat on a bench in Gorky Park, snow falling soft as whispers, and watched the world move around me. I had come seeking a country. I had found a